Where does the idea of a Homer emerge from?
Yes.
Because I think most people listening to this, it's like, well, but there's a name like
the Iliad by Homer.
Yeah, so like then who's Homer?
So it's the ancient Greeks who thought of these poems as being by Homer.
So we're not totally wrong then.
Well, I mean, I don't want to apply right or wrong.
Okay.
There's debate. Was there really a Trojan War? Did the Greeks actually go to Troy and fight? I mean, there's a lot of really interesting archaeological evidence that doesn't necessarily clarify the question, but adds a lot of interesting detail to consider about that.
As archaeological evidence can do. Did Homer really write the Iliad? And why should you care about this war story from a couple thousand years ago? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, we are turning to some broader ancient Mediterranean literature, two of the most famous stories of all time, and one of the most famous authors, if he existed, of all time, Homer and the Homeric literature that is the Iliad and the Odyssey. We are going to be diving into these texts with Dr. Celsiana Warwick, one of her own here at the University of Iowa. If you have ever had questions about the point of the Iliad, the identity of Homer, or what we're supposed to do with any of this today, this podcast is for you. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and exclusive bonus content like a weekly bonus podcast, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. Dr. Warwick, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk today about one of your favorite people, maybe a person, maybe not a person, our friend Homer. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
Can we start with, I guess, a personal question before we get into the mists of him? Why Homer for you? Because this is such a personal and passionate thing, and everyone's research topic is so unique. When did you catch the Homer bug?
Well, I've been obsessed with Greek mythology since elementary school, which is the case with, many of our majors, I'm sure will tell you that, and many classes as well. My mother read me the Odyssey when I was a kid.
How young?
I'm not sure, maybe 8. I mean, the Odyssey is pretty accessible.
It is?
Yeah. But she had the impression that the Iliad was not as good or something. So she didn't read me that. I didn't read the Iliad until I was a freshman in college. And at that point, it was like no going back. I remember I was finishing it on the quad with tears streaming down my face. And it was like, okay, this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. This is it.
So you started with, your first experience was the Odyssey.
Well, my first experience was Greek mythology for children.
Yeah.
So I knew all the stories. But yeah, my first Homer, official Homer was the Odyssey.
Which I think, as we'll get into, it surprises me a little bit because the Iliad is so much the one that you love.
Yes, I'm such an Iliad person.
That it's I guess it's the second one. It was more of your pick at that time a little bit. Okay, that's interesting. Yes, disclaimer, you much prefer the Iliad to the Odyssey if we're doing an announcement up
it's front. I don't want to denigrate the Odyssey.
It's not bad. It's
wonderful, right? The Odyssey is a wonderful poem. I love the Odyssey, but the Iliad is for my heart.
Okay.
I feel like it's for me.
So you feel very personal, in your relationship.
Oh, extremely.
More so than the Odyssey? The Odyssey is just kind of...
The Odyssey doesn't feel as personal, absolutely. I don't identify strongly with the characters in the Odyssey the way I do with Achilles in the Iliad, which many people might think that's a weird thing to say, that I do identify so strongly with him. It's being a former gifted kid overachiever, feeling this strong sense of, people aren't appreciating me.
Okay. I think that makes sense. It's a very different character. So we'll come back to the stories in case you're we'll jump back into the Iliad and the Odyssey in a second. Can I take one step back again, though?
Yes.
To the maybe person responsible for them, because we're talking about Homer and some of Homer's works. But should we be talking about Homer or Homers or not a Homer at all? The question of authorship, I think, is one of these things that some people kind of know is a debate, but maybe don't understand all of the reasons why it is a debate. So
Yes.
for you, when students are introduced with this, how do you go about explaining the identity of Homer?
Yes. Well, I start with the oral tradition.
Okay.
So we know that the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? We have these texts, right? If you go back to we have the Greek text of the Iliad and the Greek text of the Odyssey that have been passed down from antiquity and like recopied throughout the Middle Ages and survived to us in the form of Byzantine manuscripts. So that's what you're reading a translation of if you pick up the Iliad or the Odyssey from a shelf.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how did those texts form?
Yes.
How were they written down and when and how? So we know that they come originally from an oral tradition because oral traditions have many characteristic kind of hallmarks. Like, for example, if you're reading, the Homeric poems, you might notice that there's a lot of repetition of various kinds.
Mm-hmm.
People have repeated epithets, right? Like Polymatus Odysseus, right? Very wise Odysseus, or however the translator renders that, or swift-footed Achilles.
Yeah.
These appear over and over. So epithets are a very characteristic marker of oral poetry. So are, just repeated chunks of dialogue, right? So we'll have Zeus tell the messenger goddess Iris, go tell this character this. And so we'll have the whole speech from Zeus, and then Iris will go to that character and just repeat the whole speech, right, with the pronouns switched. But, and so students who are learning Greek enjoy that because they're like, oh, I just translated all of this. I did this already.
I should remember all of these words.
Yes. Do I? Well,
we'll find out in a second.
Yes, Jordan, you can answer that question.
Not always. We do not remember all of the words every time. No.
Yes. But so that can strike a modern reader as very odd because you're like, well, I just read this. Why have you done it again? The reason is it's originally designed for people who are listening. So if you don't have a text in front of you, if you're listening to an oral performer, you might not remember exactly what Zeus said to Iris, right? So you're not like mad that it's repeated again.
It helps jog your memory.
It jogs your memory. And also it's helpful for the performer. These things like epithets, repetition, things like type scenes, where, for example, a warrior will always put on his armor in the same order, regardless of who it is. These help the performer who is, basically they don't have a script, right? So this is something that can be difficult for people. Is they think like, oh, maybe the oral performer like memorized the Iliad and then recites it from memory. But the thing is, there is no original Iliad to memorize. Like that concept comes from the idea of a written text, which doesn't exist.
Okay, so can we spend a moment there? Because I do think that is one of the things from our perspective looking back. It's like, well, I can memorize a song or a musical or the lines to this thing.
Yeah.
And so there was some script that they were working off. But there is nothing written for these oral performers to access.
Correct. Like in a traditional oral culture, there is no original script.
So how do they end up with something that they can share?
Yes, this is a great question. So what they have is called the tradition. So this is like the body of, knowledge, plots, epithets, type scenes, vocabulary, meter, all of these things that go into making the poem. This is commonly shared by the performers of this tradition. So
okay.
So they know what's supposed to happen in the story, and the audience knows what's supposed to happen in the story, right? It's not like the audience is surprised by any of these events.
This is information that they know from other stories.
Yeah,
other
and like they've grown up hearing these stories.
Much like you with the mythology before getting into the Odyssey.
Yeah, or like if you grew up going to church, you hear the Bible stories since you're a small child, and so you know what happens with Noah and the ark.
Right. There's a general knowledge about it.
Yeah, and I think maybe even a much more detailed knowledge than we would have now, because in an oral culture, people are just trained to rely on their memories much more, because you can't like write down your shopping list or whatever you need to remember. You got to remember it in your head. So the audience knows like basically what in what order things in a story are supposed to happen. And even things like, what are these people supposed to say to each other in this scene? Like maybe not exactly word for word, but they know like when Achilles and Agamemnon have an argument, they know what the argument's supposed to be about. They know what they're supposed to yell at each other. So the poet comes in knowing that he has to produce what the audience is expecting, right? What he has learned, from his teachers. And of course, in this specific instance of the Homeric tradition, the performers that we know of, the rhapsodes or the Homeridae, called themselves the sons of Homer, who performed the Iliad and the Odyssey, we know of them as being male. But that doesn't mean that women had no influence on this tradition, as I would elaborate on at a later time, perhaps.
So within them having an accountability to the audience, the audience kind of knows. Do they have no creative freedom within that, or are they allowed to kind of play with the audience and what the audience might expect?
Well, this is actually a majorly contentious question.
Oh, good. Well, let's get you on the record then for your position.
Well, it's this question of like, how much freedom does an oral poet have to innovate? So some people would say zero. That and depending on like how rigid the tradition is, right? They might say, well, no, like there's an agreement about what they're supposed to say. And so the characters can't do something new, right? It has to be exactly the way it always was. I mean, in terms of like reflecting the values of the culture or something. Now, I think this is not, based on studies of how oral poetry really works, I don't think this is actually true because, even if you are following, a plot point by point, you can always add your own spin to it because we know that performers don't recreate a song exactly the same way every time. Even between their own performances, there might be variation. And that might be because, well, I have less time, so I'm going to do a shorter version, or I have a lot of time, I'll do a longer version. So maybe this scene gets more description or there's more dialogue back and forth. But sometimes performers change. This has been documented from Milman Parry's recordings of South Slavic oral poets in the early 20th century. They could change the story based on the context in which they're performing it. So, for example, there was a poet who the first time that a story was recorded or a poem was recorded, this was before communism in the former Yugoslavia. And so he set a particular scene at a mosque because that was the traditional setting for it. They come back, 20 years later, record the same poet singing the same song. The mosque has completely disappeared because religion is now no longer socially acceptable. And in fact, this particular poet had taken a position in the Communist Party. So he's sort of self-censoring in that way. The
needs of the poet and the community have changed.
Exactly. And, that's in one person's lifespan. And if we think about the context of the Homeric poems in the ancient world, the early archaic period in ancient Greece was an incredibly volatile time with a lot of social upheaval and change. So we can imagine there might be any number of things that might be like contested values that maybe the community themselves are not sure how they feel about the heroic values of these warriors, or even something like gender roles or the relationship between the aristocracy and the common people. Like all of these things, I think, are not necessarily set in stone.
What period of time then is this flux and development happening? I guess from when scholars are comfortable saying something begins to when we get a thing that is more stable? I guess kind of what scope of time are we looking at or talking about when you're saying, it's not just one individual's life, this broader arc?
Yeah. So the oral tradition, we know, went back very far in time. If we're looking at the age of some of these poetic formulas that we can date using, linguistic methods, some of them certainly go back to the Mycenaean period, which would be the Greek Bronze Age. So that would be the time when the Trojan War is traditionally said to have taken place, right? There's debate. Was there really a Trojan War? Did the Greeks actually go to Troy and fight? There's a lot of really interesting archaeological evidence that doesn't necessarily clarify the question, but adds a lot of interesting detail to consider about that.
As archaeological evidence can do, it gives you something, but not necessarily the answer you might be looking for.
Exactly. So it's possible, right, that the oral tradition that comes down to us as the Iliad and the Odyssey is a distant reflection of an actual war that happened in the Mycenaean Bronze Age. Now, there's even older formulas that go back to Proto-Indo-European, which is the parent language of Greek and a bunch of other languages like Latin, Sanskrit, the Iranian languages, Germanic languages, basically most of the European languages and the South Asian languages. So the concept of kleos aptheton, which in Greek means unwithering fame, basically fame that doesn't die, that concept goes back to Proto-Indo-European because we can trace that formula in all of these different languages. Like there's an exact Sanskrit cognate to this formula. So the oral tradition itself is thousands of years old. So when you're like, how old is this?
Old.
Very old, very old. So, but then what we're looking at when we look at our text, that clearly could not have been written down any earlier than the 8th century BCE because that's when the Greek alphabet was invented. And the text couldn't be fixed until it was written down. So it may have been written down later than that, right? This is part of the debate.
Yes. Of how old does the thing need to be, or how young does it need to be? Which, it connects to some of the same debates regarding authorship of anything, of like how important is the idea of the author or the community or the development over time. So that is kind of the earliest it could be written down. When's the latest that people float kind of writing down might have emerged?
So the latest date for the text being fixed, meaning it's the official text, there's no variance, Gregory Nagy sets that in the Hellenistic period, when the scholars at the Library of Alexandria compiled their official texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
So a much later date.
Much later date. So Nagy doesn't think that was its original writing down. He thinks that different versions maybe got written down over time. Like he thinks that when the tyrant Pisistratus in the 6th century BC in Athens was holding competitions for people to recite Homer, he thinks that maybe a number of performance scripts were produced there. And so there were kind of different versions that later got compiled and condensed down into the official text that we have. Now, this is not the only theory. Some people think that the Iliad was written down much earlier in the 8th century BCE. Some people think maybe the Greek alphabet was even invented to write down Homer. That's maybe a bit of a fringe theory. But so, the question is like our text that we have, how did that happen? Right? So there's the oral dictation theory, which is that some king decided that he wanted a written text of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So he commissioned some poet to basically perform the poem to a scribe who would write it down. And that this is how the text of the Iliad and the Odyssey were produced. Now, there is some evidence in favor of this, which is that the Iliad and the Odyssey are way, way, way longer than a normal oral poem.
Yeah, they're not short.
They're not short. Well, because if you think about like what is the attention span of an audience, not super long, right? And like how long can a poet perform? Like it's very physically demanding.
Right.
So most oral poems are a lot shorter than the Iliad and the Odyssey. However, it was documented that when, Milman Parry and his student Albert Lord and other people who went and asked oral poets, hey, can you perform this poem to my dictation or like into my recording device? The poet was like, oh, I can take as much time as I want. And suddenly the poem gets way longer and much more detailed.
Okay.
So that could explain the unusual length.
Because it's not a short read. It's an enjoyable read, both of them. But if you're thinking of them as like something you are just listening to, It's a long sitting.
You can't just listen to them in an evening, right?
No.
This is not just after dinner entertainment.
Or it's a very long after dinner entertainment.
Well,
You're really dedicated.
They've estimated that it would take maybe like 3 days, 8 hours a day to get through one of the whole poems.
Yeah, so more than one quick performance.
Yeah, and that would be a lot.
It would be. That's much more dedication than I would have to sit through, or I guess to have either one of them performed to me. Can I ask too, within this, if we're talking about all these different ways that oral development over time has happened,
yeah,
and you've thrown out like the sons of Homer as maybe some of these performers, where does the idea of a Homer emerge from?
Yes. Yes.
Because I think most people listening to this, it's like, well, but there's a name, like there's a Homer that wrote
the Iliad by Homer.
Yeah, so like then who's Homer?
Yeah, so it's the ancient Greeks who thought of these poems as being by Homer. So
we're not totally wrong then.
Well, I mean, I don't want to apply right or wrong.
Okay.
So Homer was I guess sort of legendary bard, singer, who the ancient Greeks attributed not only the Iliad and the Odyssey to, but a whole bunch of other stories from this kind of like ancient epic world. So other stories about the Trojan War heroes, like the Iliad only is about 40 days in the 9th year of the Trojan War. So the rest of the Trojan War story, that was in other epic poems. So they thought of Homer as having basically composed that entire cycle of poetry, right? The Odyssey being another one, right? Just the return home of Odysseus. That's just one story in the much larger Trojan War saga. There's also the story of Oedipus, various other myths, like the Argonauts. So they thought of Homer as basically having done all of this.
The best one.
Yeah. Like that. Well, that Homer is the author of all of these ancient stories. Now, like sometimes different poems got attributed to different people. Like some people would say, well, Homer did this poem, and then someone else might say, no, it was actually this other guy. But there was this idea that Homer had composed a lot of this stuff.
Okay.
And then there were various sort of biographies of Homer, like that Homer was this sort of blind poet. You can read various compilations, like Herodotus has I guess maybe it's by pseudo-Herodotus. We don't know if it's actually Herodotus, but there's a Herodotean style life of Homer where he's traveling around these islands and having different adventures. But this is all, this is not based on historical fact, because if Homer existed, Homer would have lived before history was written down.
Yes.
So,
if we're looking at some of the long span of these stories,
yes.
If there's a Homer that kicked this all off, he's way, way, way back.
Yeah. Well, then it's like, what does Homer really mean? Is Homer the first person to make up or sing the story of the Trojan War? And a lot of the Greeks thought, well, that's what Homer would be. And therefore they would locate Homer back in the Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. Herodotus actually locates Homer in like the 9th century BC, which is pretty low for an ancient Greek date. But the Greeks, they have this kind of fuzzy, they don't really know what was happening in those centuries that we call the Greek Dark Age, between the fall of the Bronze Age civilizations and the beginning of the Greek Archaic period. So that's it's all mysterious to them. It's pretty mysterious to us because we don't have historical sources and there's not great archaeological evidence.
Because it was foggy to them, it ends up being foggy for us as well.
Exactly. And just, there was a lot of like population decline and we just don't really know what was happening.
So do some of the traditions about Homer as, like you've mentioned, the blind bard, or these different theories of if he was a prisoner of war or where he might have been from.
Yes.
Those all emerge within these ancient tellings of Homer, or do they come later on? Like, are any of those modern flushings out of those, or are those all kind of?
No, they're all ancient.
Okay.
The ancients, of course, were very, very interested in Homer and had all sorts of stories about him. And trying to explain his name, like, is it derived from Homeros hostage or, something like that? Mm-hmm. Was he from, like, what city was he from? Various different cities in, Ionia, which is the Greek cities on the coast of Turkey claimed that Homer
Everybody
was from
wants
there.
it.
Everybody wants Homer. Exactly. Exactly. So the question is, was there a real person named Homer? Maybe. Like, we have no way of knowing if there was or wasn't.
Is it a significant question for them? Like the question of an identity of an author behind these? Does that really matter for the weight of it in an earlier period or at a later period? Or is it just something that kind of, as authorship emerges and becomes a tradition, grows more and more attached to these stories as like a sign of authorship, not authorship, but authority? Or just
definitely it's a sign of authority, right? To attribute something to Homer is to give it authority.
It becomes a stamp of approval.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so then can we turn to some of these stories then? We won't go through all of them. As you said, he gets connected to a lot. But the big two, the Iliad and the Odyssey, is the two that people are most familiar with.
Yeah.
If I could, there's many hours within these, but your SparkNotes summary of where they sit. You already mentioned the Iliad coming in at the end of the Trojan War, the Odyssey, the Return. How do these two function in the world of Homeric literature? And to start with, why do they matter for us today?
Why do they matter for us today?
It's a story of people dying a long time ago or going home maybe a long time ago.
I get this question a lot where people are like, why should I care about something so old? And first of all, I have a hard time answering it because I'm like, because it's old.
It's really old. Yeah, we get that question.
Is that not just cool?
Is it? Yeah, we get that all the time. Like, well, why do you care? Like, why? It's still around. Why don't you care?
Yeah, well, I mean, with the Bible, you can make all kinds of arguments for why it's still very important for like modern politics. With Homer, I mean, it's not obviously. The Homeric poems are not as culturally relevant as the Bible. We can say that.
Well, but there's parts of it that feel like they very much are.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, like Christopher Nolan is doing the Odyssey and that's a whole thing.
Yes, there's a lot of movie adaptations and things, but I guess some of those themes like that emerge through these within the stories of the conflict in the Iliad are so timeless and do feel still so relevant.
I mean, I think so. Like, I think that they're the kind of stories that people can appreciate at any time. I mean, the Iliad, just a brief SparkNotes summary, is about a very talented, hot-headed subordinate who has an incompetent boss.
Something no one has any experience with.
This is something people experience in all times, and especially, I would say in the modern culture, many people have had this experience. Now, not everyone reacts in the same way as Achilles.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Yes. So for those who don't know what happens, Achilles is the greatest of the Greek warriors at Troy. He's the son of a goddess, so he has sort of near supernatural abilities in terms of his ability as a warrior. But Agamemnon is the leader of the Greek army because he has, the biggest contingent of ships and soldiers that he brought. So he's in charge. And the Greeks end up in this pickle, we'll call it, because Agamemnon, while they were raiding some cities, he took as a slave the daughter of a priest of Apollo.
A bit of a pickle.
Yes. Well, the problem is that the priest came to ransom his daughter, which is an accepted practice, right? That if people get taken in war, their families can ransom them back, especially if they're an important person like a priest or a king or something. So the priest comes and he's like, can I please have my daughter back? I've brought, all of these gifts. Agamemnon's like, no, absolutely not. Leave or I will kill you, basically. And so this is a no-no because it offends Apollo, who is, among other things, the god of plague. So Apollo sends a plague on the Greeks, and a lot of them start dying. And Achilles calls a meeting of all the Greeks, and he says, okay, we know what's gone wrong. We've offended Apollo. We better return this girl to her father. And Agamemnon's like, no, it's not fair. If my, slave girl who was my prize, my war prize, gets taken away from me, I need to have somebody else's prize because I, the most powerful, can't be without a prize. And Achilles is like, well, this is ridiculous. All the prizes have already been distributed. You could have another prize later, but there's none left. You're just going to take someone's prize. And Agamemnon's like, yeah, absolutely. I'll take yours. I'm taking yours now. I'm taking your slave girl. Obviously, it's upsetting to us that the prizes in question are human women.
Yes.
That's not great. But the sort of principle of the thing of like the incompetent boss has majorly screwed up and is now punishing the subordinate for his screw up. I think everyone has encountered situations like that. Yes. So Agamemnon does take Achilles' war prize, who is a human woman named Briseis. But within the sort of values of the Homeric society, this is a huge dishonor to Achilles.
Right.
And this is a society where everything is based on honor. Like, what is your public standing in the community? And Achilles, being more concerned with his honor and future glory than anything else, because he knows he's going to die young if he fights at Troy. He's like, I'm only here. I didn't have to come here, Agamemnon. There was no reason for me to come. I'm doing you a favor. Also, like, I know I'm going to die.
Right.
You've just like tarnished my honor that I'm willing to die for. So he withdraws from the war. He says, forget it. I'm not fighting. And so the Greeks, get their asses handed to them by the Trojans. You shouldn't have asked me to summarize the Iliad. It's going to take so long.
I think the summary is helpful because for a lot of people, their experience with it is like, maybe I've seen Troy.
The movie Troy.
Or I just kind of in passing know, like, there's a story of a battle. But I do think fleshing part of this out is really helpful because it does speak to, like, well, why does this still matter? There's so much within it that is still relevant to us, but also opens up questions of complication and debate within that. Not just around their actions, but around like how we feel about their actions or how we connect to a character or not. Because having been in some classes where some of these people come up, like the name Agamemnon, how you feel about a character like him or should not feel can become places of a real passionate conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't encountered a lot of like Agamemnon fans.
Not a lot of Agamemnon fans.
But definitely Achilles has he's very polarizing.
He is.
Because some people love him. I mean, like, so I acknowledge he's very problematic, right? We can acknowledge that. But I just am like so drawn to the problems that he is causing, right? I feel like a worse version of myself would behave in the same way. Like, I experience those impulses.
He does cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, but okay, so like the question is he justified, first of all, in withdrawing from the war? Some people are like, no, because his friends are going to be killed by the Trojans if he doesn't fight to protect them. But then it's like, well, I mean, is he obligated to do that? And, maybe Agamemnon is the one in the wrong and should have compensated him. Things get more complicated because about midway through the Iliad, Agamemnon does send an embassy and a bunch of gifts and Briseis back to Achilles to say, okay, I was, I guess maybe I was sort of slightly wrong. Can you come back and fight, please?
Help me out, please.
Yeah. And Achilles says no, because he's now unsure if he actually wants to die for his eternal glory. He's very confused. Some people are like, he's taken a principled stand against, the heroic values. I don't know that that's exactly what he's doing, but he's really unsure about what he wants to do at that point. And he's not sure that dying for glory is his best option. But he hasn't decided that it isn't. So he's stuck. He keeps threatening to go home, but he doesn't go home.
His big pout when he goes back to his tent and he hangs out there for a long time.
He's just in his tent while the Greeks and Trojans are continuing to fight.
Just hanging out in my room. I'm going to stay here while I think over things.
Yeah, well, and he's playing like songs. He's singing songs about the glories of men. So like the heroes before him, which we don't know. We're not given their names, but so he's still like he's obsessed with glory. But he's now like, is this right? And everything I thought was right, is it really right?
Yeah.
But I can't let go of it.
Because it's the flame that just keeps drawing him back in.
Yeah.
Is it, if we jump a little bit ahead in the end, because eventually he does decide to tap into the fight after some events happen. What leads him back in?
What leads him back in? Yes. So Achilles has a very close companion named Patroclus. And Patroclus is not okay with the Greeks dying. He's like, these are my friends. I'm really upset about this. So he comes and yells at Achilles and says, well, if you're not going to do anything, at least give me your armor and I'll go out and, lead your troops into battle and save the Greeks. And so Achilles feels bad because Patroclus is mad and he doesn't want Patroclus to be upset. So he says, okay, you can do that. Unfortunately, Patroclus is then killed. He does save the Greeks, right? He pushes the Trojans back, but he's then killed. He's killed, first of all, by the god Apollo, who comes onto the battlefield and smites him. Then a total nobody Trojan named Euphorbus kind of sticks him with a spear. And then Hector finishes him off. Hector, the Prince of Troy, like one of the main characters. Anyway, so he's dead and Hector is ultimately responsible. So that's what gets Achilles back into the war, because he says, I have to go kill Hector to get revenge for my, dearest companion who has been killed.
In his return back, and I guess this is a question I have about his motivations, how you see his motivations in coming back, because the whole glory question has been so looming. Is that, how do you weigh out within it? Because it doesn't feel like there's just one answer to what gets him back.
Yeah, his question that he's dealing with in the middle of the poem, where he's like, do I stay? Do I go? Do I want this? Do I not? It's not really answered because he enters the battle again for a different reason. So he enters the battle to avenge his friend, and he knows that as a consequence of that, he will die. And he will get the eternal glory. And so he's then, like, okay, this is the path I'm going on. But it wasn't because he decided that was actually what he wanted. And in fact, it seems clear that what he really would like is for Patroclus to still be alive.
If he had a choice, he would rather have that than the glory.
He doesn't explicitly say that, but it seems very clear. And this is some things that I discuss in my forthcoming book that will be hopefully published next year from Oxford University Press, which is that at the end of the Iliad, Achilles does not seem to be particularly interested in glory. His glory is now assured, but he doesn't care about it.
And now that he has it, it doesn't seem to matter so much. Or now that, because he has it, but he doesn't really have it until he's dead.
Well, he doesn't have it until he's dead. He knows he's going to die. He doesn't actually seem to want to be alive particularly.
Yeah.
He does feel bad that he's going to die and leave his dad alone in his old age with no one to take care of him. Like that, he's concerned about that. He's not like, but it's okay because I'll have eternal glory.
Right. It doesn't seem to really balance the scales.
It does not balance the scales. He's miserable.
Because if we jump way ahead into the Odyssey, in the Nekia tradition, when Odysseus gets to talk to him.
Yes, Odysseus goes down to the underworld and talks to dead Achilles. And he's like, well, Achilles, you have all this glory. It's so great. Like, good for you.
Yeah, congratulations.
Achilles is like, I would rather be like the lowest like laborer on earth than king over all the dead.
So it does seem to then, I guess, back up your reading that it doesn't hold so well at the end for that glory desire. Is that a critique within this tradition of what he should be doing? Or is that just his individual unique perspective and that's allowed without it really being an attack? Because that does feel like it strikes against a lot of those heroic ideals that so much of the story is spending its time on.
Yeah. Well, so I will say that I've given you my interpretation of the end of the Iliad. This is not everyone's interpretation. Some people think that, Achilles at the end of the Iliad has returned basically to the state he was at the beginning of the poem before he started questioning everything. And they give various explanations for this. I don't agree, right? And I have laid out in detail elsewhere why I don't agree with that. So I think that the Iliad is deeply concerned with interrogating the values of this heroic society that it depicts, like in part because, as I said, the culture of archaic Greece, in which the poetic tradition, if not the exact text of the poem itself, was formed, is one of great upheaval. And the society depicted in the Homeric poems is not the society of the Greek polis, right, that becomes dominant and is sort of like the form of Greek government and life that we're most familiar with from the historical Greek period, right? Like the Greeks of the polis, they fight in the hoplite phalanx They're not doing single combat. It's much more, rather than individual glory, it's about, well, I want to fight well, but it's for my city, and if I'm doing something glorious that doesn't benefit my city, that's actually bad. But we have accounts of people being punished for breaking ranks to like rush out and fight first.
Like you see all the time in the Iliad, where there are all these one-on-one combat.
Yeah, the Iliad is all about one-on-one combat.
Yeah. And horrifically and graphically so in its descriptions of one-on-one combat.
Yeah. I mean, it could be like if you compare the Iliad to like some Roman epic like Lucan, actually, you can see it could be much more graphic.
Yes.
But yes, there are some graphic things in the Iliad, like sometimes someone's brain will fall out.
Every now and then a brain falls
their
out.
Their eyeballs will pop out of their skull.
Yeah, spears going through the back of skulls, and just, but it's a description of war. And so in that,
description of war.
It spends its time there. And that feels like one of those weights, I guess, if you're proposing a different reading of it, where because so much of it is facing directly into war, it can look like it's glorifying the fighting and all of the things that go along with it. Is that a part of what allows you to also see maybe in its presentation of it, it's really not glorifying it, but using that description to then undercut that same thing?
Well, this is also hotly debated, and it taps into a larger question of like, does the depiction of violence like encourage violence or promote violence?
Which I think still taps into some of the, if you play violent video games.
Yes, if you play violent or like violent war movies.
Watch
today,
movies, yeah.
So some people would say the depiction of violence is horrific. It's clearly wanting to portray this as bad. Other people say, no, like this is violence that's portrayed like for the pleasure of the audience. They're enjoying this. And this is something people argue about constantly with like modern movies.
Yeah.
Right. And like, is this war movie pro-war or anti-war? And it's the same movie and people have drawn totally different conclusions. The point is, I think that, if the Iliad is being performed to a large group of, a large section of the Greek community, there's going to be all different kinds of people with different social statuses and different views on what's happening, and they are probably reacting to it in different ways.
Right.
And that's, what the poet wants, because the poet wants the largest number of people to like the poem.
It's why it works.
Yeah. So the poet is not necessarily, this idea that the poem and the poet exist to promote traditional values. I'm not sure is super accurate, because like traditional values, assuming that a culture has one set of values, that's never true. Right? There's like different cross sections of society who may have different relationships to the elite. And this is something that I talk about a lot in my book, which is that the women in the Iliad have a very different perspective on the heroic values of the men. And they, in fact, often vocally disagree with what the men are doing. And so I think that this is an important counterpoint in the Iliad to what the men are saying, right? The women get to say their piece that they disagree with. And in fact, they're the last ones who speak in the poem, right? The laments at Hector's funeral spoken by his female relatives. And I actually argue that Achilles at the end is much more aligned with the viewpoints of the women than the other men. Again, that's my interpretation.
But it draws on, I think, a part of what's in the Iliad that most people maybe don't think of, which is it gets foregrounded as this story about war. But it's not just about war, and it's not just scenes of men fighting on the battlefield. It's not just
scenes of men fighting. Well, it's about war, but it's about war not as a, like, isn't war great? Like, some of the characters definitely...
Some of them think it's pretty great.
It's great. And Achilles definitely has periods of having that feeling. I think a lot of the characters go in and out, where they'll be like really into it and they're doing great and they're killing a lot of guys, and then things go against them and they're like, oh, this is extremely bad.
Yeah, maybe I don't like this part so much anymore, because at some point they do have a desire to go home, right? They're here for a very long time.
Yes.
It takes way longer than it should, seemingly.
Yes.
And we won't get into all the Odyssey and some of the return cycles home, I think for sake of time today, because there's a whole divergence there which opens up different questions or returns to themes like getting to talk to him in the underworld that comes to some of this. Could I ask for someone who is thinking, I've never read the Iliad before or the Odyssey before, and I only know about it from passings, but you have sparked their interest. And in wanting to prepare themselves for your forthcoming work, they really want to go and read the Iliad in an English translation. Where should they turn?
This is a question that I get a lot. And my answer is the best translation for you is whichever one you find most readable. And that depends. Different people want different things.
Yeah.
Like some people want a translation that's really poetic. Other people want one that is written in like easier to understand English. And then some people are really concerned that the translation be accurate.
Yes.
And that's very difficult because no translation is going to capture exactly what the Greek is like.
It's like it can only be accurate to a certain extent. There's always a degree of accuracy and a degree of inaccuracy in any translation.
Yes. And even the more you try to get super accurate in terms of like, what do these words really mean? Sort of the further you get from the feel of reading the poetry in the original Greek. So it's always that kind of balance. I would say my personal favorite translation of the Iliad is Carolyn Alexander's. I feel like there's a really nice balance there between readability, accuracy, reflecting kind of a flavor of the original. Unfortunately, she didn't do an Odyssey, just an Iliad.
I think you're probably okay with that. I mean, it would be nice to have both.
No, I mean, obviously they should read the Odyssey. Everyone should read the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Yeah, I mean...
And like, let's be honest, the Odyssey is much more accessible.
It does feel... It's very adventure story.
Yeah, it feels much more like a modern novel than the Iliad. I think the Iliad does have these very long sequences where it's like just long battle sequences of guys killing each other. And then there's all of these like nature similes interspersed. And I really love it. But I'm not reading it so much as a story in those sections. I'm reading it as like poetry.
Yes.
And I think Alice Oswald's Memorial, which is a translation of basically just the deaths and the similes, does a really good job of capturing the poetry of those sections.
Because the Odyssey does feel a lot more like you sit down and you're opening up a novel.
Yes.
And if you removed yourself from the understanding of what it had come from, I think you could really think like, oh, this is not emerging out of poetry. Look at the story that's being told and feels so different than the Iliad. I mean, coming in, the Odyssey was always my preferred of the two until I was coerced otherwise. And I think correctly so, because the Iliad, I was in that camp of like, well, it's just a lot of die and description through. And I'm like, do we need all of this part? Understanding more of the development of it, though, I think does really flesh out the reason why all of that's in there and the connections between them, because it is, you look at the two of them next to each other, they are so immensely different from each other, but are both very interesting and should pay attention to them because they are still around. They have lasted, which makes them all the more fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I think that this question, and returning to the question of why should you read something so old?
Yeah.
Well, I think that in general, people should be interested in things beyond their own immediate cultural context, whether that's something very old or something that comes from another culture that exists now. I think it's very limiting to only care about the things that you're familiar with. And I think that it can broaden the richness of your experience as a human, right? To try to understand people's ways of thinking in other times and places. But also, I think that the Homeric Epics are just bangers.
They are a good read if you're looking for something to jump into.
And you know what? If you want to skim through all the lists of guys killing each other, like, you have my permission. That's fine.
Unless it's assigned reading for class.
Unless it's assigned reading for class, in which case,
any
no mercy.
Any future students listening to this, you can't bring this in. That doesn't count for that.
Correct.
That's just reading for fun.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Dr. Warwick, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and explain some of Homer and some of the Iliad. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
For everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.